The courtroom of the Fairfax County Circuit Court sat in heavy, suffocating silence. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of dark mahogany benches. The seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia hung behind the elevated judge's bench, a figure of virtue standing over a defeated tyrant, with the words Sic Semper Tyrannis carved beneath, thus always to tyrants. The irony would reveal itself before the day was done. On the left side of the courtroom sat Harold Raymond Whitfield, Sr. Alone, completely, devastatingly alone. His blind eyes stared forward at nothing. His trembling hands rested on the wooden table before him, fingers laced together so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, not from cold, but from the sheer effort of holding himself together. His threadbare gray suit hung from his shoulders like a burial shroud. No attorney sat beside him. No family member occupied the bench behind him. No friend. No ally. No witness to his decades of love and sacrifice. Just an old blind man sitting in the cold machinery of American justice with nothing but his dignity. And across the aisle, Derek Whitfield leaned back in his chair like a king surveying conquered territory. His Tom Ford suit gleamed under the courtroom lights. His Rolex caught the fluorescence and threw tiny golden reflections across the ceiling. Beside him sat a $700 an hour attorney from one of Virginia's most aggressive firms. Behind him sat Victoria, legs crossed, examining her manicure with theatrical boredom. Marcus sat next to her, fidgeting, sweating, but present on their side. 3 children, not one sitting with their father. Derek tilted his head toward his attorney and whispered something. They both laughed. Quietly, just loud enough for the sound to travel across the aisle and reach Harold's ears. The old man's jaw tightened. His clouded eyes glistened. He heard that laugh. He couldn't see their faces, but he heard that laugh, and it cut deeper than any blade because he recognized it. It was the same laugh he'd taught Derek as a boy, the same laugh they'd shared over ice cream cones and baseball games and bedtime stories. The same laugh that once meant love. Now it meant contempt. Harold's chin dropped slightly toward his chest, but he did not break. Not yet. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. All rise. The Honorable Judge Catherine Okonkwo presiding. Judge Okonkwo entered the courtroom with the gravity of a woman who understood that law without compassion was tyranny, and compassion without law was chaos. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room with eyes that cataloged everything: the empty chairs behind Harold, the expensive suits across the aisle, the power imbalance so grotesque it was almost theatrical. This court is now in session, she said evenly. Case number 23-7419. In the matter of the conservatorship and estate of Harold Raymond Whitfield, Sr. Counsel, identify yourselves for the record. Derek's attorney stood smoothly. Your Honor, Graham Phillips of Hargrove, Phillips and Associates, representing Derek Whitfield, Victoria Whitfield Ashford, and Marcus Whitfield, the petitioners, seeking to maintain the current conservatorship arrangement and affirm the distribution of assets as outlined in the existing will dated March 14, 2020. Judge Okonkwo's eyes moved to the other table. To Harold, to the empty chair beside him, and for the respondent, silence. Harold slowly, painfully, rose to his feet. His hand found the edge of the table for balance. His voice came out thin, cracked, but clear. I am, representing myself, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a 74-year-old blind man, representing himself, against a team of attorneys funded by his own stolen money. Derek didn't even try to hide his smile. Victoria whispered to Marcus, loud enough to carry, "This is embarrassing." He can't even see the judge. The words landed like a slap. Harold's hand trembled against the table, but his spine straightened one vertebra at a time, as if Eleanor's ghost were pressing her palm against the small of his back, whispering, "Stand up, my love, stand up." Graham Phillips wasted no time. He approached the bench with a folder thick with documents and a voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "Your Honor, it is the petitioner's position that Mr. Whitfield Sr. is no longer capable of managing his own affairs. His medical records confirm bilateral blindness, early-stage cognitive decline, and an inability to perform basic daily functions without assistance. The conservatorship granted to his eldest son, Derek, was established for his own protection. The family home was transferred into the children's names to ensure its maintenance and to avoid tax complications. The existing will, signed by Mr. Whitfield himself, distributes the estate equally among his 3 children upon his passing, with Derek serving as executor." He paused, smiled at the judge. The respondent's objections are, respectfully, the confused complaints of an elderly man who does not fully understand the legal arrangements made for his benefit. Harold's fingers curled against the table. For his benefit. They had thrown him out of his own house at 2 a.m. on a January night. Temperature, 26 degrees. They had changed the locks while he was at a doctor's appointment, an appointment Derek had scheduled specifically to get him out of the house. They had packed his belongings into garbage bags. Black garbage bags, as if his 74 years of life were refuse. Victoria had stood in the doorway of the house Harold had built with his own hands in 1982. Every beam, every nail, every brick, chosen with love for a family that did not yet exist, and she had said 6 words that would echo in his skull until the day he died. "You don't live here anymore, Dad." And when Harold had stumbled down the front steps blind, disoriented, his cane slipping on the icy walkway Marcus had watched from the upstairs window, he had placed his hand against the glass. And then he had closed the curtain. The neighbors found Harold at 4 a.m, sitting on a bus stop bench 3 blocks away, shivering, holding a garbage bag containing his wife's photograph, his Bible, 2 shirts, and his military service medals from the United States Army. A man who had served his country, a man who had built an empire, a man who had given everything to his children, sitting on a bus bench in 26-degree weather, thrown away like trash. Now he stood in this courtroom, alone, and his children sat across the aisle, checking their phones. Judge Okonkwo removed her glasses. Slowly, deliberately, she was listening. And she was remembering every single word. What Derek Whitfield did not know, what none of them knew, was that Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr. was not the simple broken old man they had reduced him to in their minds. They knew he had built Whitfield Construction. They knew the company was worth $42 million at its peak. They thought they knew everything. They knew nothing. Harold Whitfield had not just built a construction company. He had built an empire, and he had built it twice. What his children never understood, because they never bothered to ask, was the depth and complexity of the man who raised them. Before Whitfield Construction, there was Whitfield Holdings, a real estate investment trust Harold had quietly established in 1978, 6 years before Derek was even born. It had been funded by profits from his earliest contracting jobs, back when Harold personally laid bricks in the Virginia summer heat, back when his hands bled and his back screamed, and he kept working because he had a vision his children would never comprehend. Whitfield Holdings owned commercial properties across 3 states, strip malls in Northern Virginia, office buildings in Richmond, warehouse complexes in Charlotte. The trust was managed not by Harold directly, but by his oldest and most trusted friend, attorney Jonathan Everett Crane. Jonathan had been Harold's roommate at Howard University. They had pledged the same fraternity. They had served in the same Army unit. Jonathan was the godfather to all 3 of Harold's children, a fact the children had conveniently forgotten because Jonathan had never offered them money, and therefore, in their calculus, he did not matter. The conservatorship that Derek had obtained, it covered Whitfield Construction and the family residence. That was all. Derek's attorneys had never searched deeper because Derek had assured them there was nothing else to find. Harold was just a blind old man with one company and one house. He was wrong. Whitfield Holdings was worth $67 million. $67 million in assets that Harold had never mentioned to his children. Not once. Not because he was hiding wealth from them out of spite, but because Eleanor had warned him. 11 years ago, on her deathbed at Innova Fairfax Hospital, Eleanor had gripped Harold's hand with surprising strength and whispered through morphine and fading breath, "They're changing, Harold. I can see it. The money is changing them." Derek looks at the company like it's already his. Victoria hasn't visited me in 3 weeks. Marcus won't look me in the eye. Promise me something. Anything, Harold had whispered, tears streaming down his face. Don't give them everything. Keep something back. Keep the part of you they can't touch, and when the time comes when you see their true faces, you'll know what to do. Harold had promised. And Harold Whitfield was a man who kept his promises, so he had kept Whitfield Holdings completely separate. Different banks, different attorneys, different everything. A parallel empire, invisible to his children, waiting in silence like a loaded weapon locked in a safe. When Derek seized control of Whitfield Construction through the fraudulent conservatorship, Harold had allowed it. When Victoria threw him out of his own house, Harold had endured it. When Marcus closed that curtain, Harold had absorbed the betrayal into his bones and kept walking through the frozen night. Not because he was weak, not because he was defeated, not because he had no options, but because Jonathan Crane had told him, with the cold precision of a military strategist, "Harold, if we strike too early, they'll hide assets, destroy documents, and lawyer up with offshore accounts. We need them confident. We need them careless. We need them to walk into that courtroom believing they've already won. And then we show them who you really are." Harold had agreed, and for 3 years he had played the role of the broken father, the abandoned patriarch, the helpless blind man. He had lived in a homeless shelter for 4 months. He had eaten donated meals. He had endured the humiliation of being pitied by strangers while his children drove Mercedes vehicles purchased with his money. Every night in that shelter, Harold would sit on his narrow cot, hold Eleanor's photograph against his chest, the photograph he could no longer see but could still feel, still smell, still remember and whisper, "Soon, Ellie, soon, and now, the day had come." Attorney Jonathan Everett Crane was not in the courtroom. Not yet. But he was close. Very close. His black Lincoln Town car was parked exactly 2 blocks from the Fairfax County Courthouse. Inside, Jonathan sat in the back seat, reviewing a leather briefcase containing documents that would detonate the Whitfield children's world like a controlled demolition which, fitting for a construction family, was exactly what it was. His phone buzzed. A text from Rosa Melendez, the guardian ad litem, who was the only person inside that courtroom who knew what was coming. 2 words. "They're ready." Jonathan Crane straightened his tie, closed his briefcase, and opened the car door. Inside the courtroom, Derek Whitfield was enjoying himself. He had taken the witness stand with the ease of a man who had rehearsed his lies until they felt like truth. His voice was warm, concerned, filial, a masterclass in performance. "Your Honor, this has been incredibly painful for our family. My father's blindness has accelerated his cognitive decline. He's confused. He's angry. And I understand that. But everything we've done, the conservatorship, the property transfer, the financial management, has been to protect him." He paused, looked at Harold, manufactured a trembling lip. "He's my father. I love him. We all do." Victoria nodded from the gallery, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a handkerchief she'd brought specifically for this moment. Marcus stared at the floor. Graham Phillips stood and addressed the court with practiced authority. Your Honor, we'd like to submit into evidence the signed conservatorship agreement, the property transfer documents, and the existing will all bearing Mr. Whitfield Sr.'s signature, all witnessed, all notarized. The respondent has provided no counter documentation, no legal representation, and no credible evidence of wrongdoing. We respectfully request that this court affirm the current arrangements and dismiss the respondent's objections. He said it with finality, as if the case were already over, and from the outside it appeared to be. Harold sat at his table, silent. His hands had stopped trembling. His head was slightly tilted the way blind people tilt their heads when they're listening to sounds others can't hear. He heard something. Footsteps. In the corridor. Measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had walked the halls of federal courthouses, military tribunals, and Supreme Court chambers for 4 decades. Harold's lips moved, almost imperceptibly. Not a smile. Something deeper. Something that might have been called readiness. Judge Okonkwo looked at Harold. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes lingered on the empty chair beside him for a long moment. Mr. Whitfield Sr., she said, her voice carrying a weight that silenced every whisper in the room. Before I make any rulings, I want to ask you directly. Do you have any evidence, any documentation, or any witnesses you wish to present to this court? The question hung in the air like a held breath. Derek's attorney almost laughed. Almost, he caught himself. But the micro-expression was there, the slight upturn of the lips, the brief exchange of glances with Derek that said, "This is over." The old man has nothing. Harold rose slowly. His blind eyes pointed somewhere above the judge's head. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Calm, the voice of a man who had carried a secret for 3 years and was finally ready to set it down. "Your Honor, I do." Derek's smile flickered, just barely, like a candle flame disturbed by a draft from a door that was about to open. And somewhere in the corridor the footsteps grew louder. Click, 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 the unmistakable rhythm of Oxford shoes on marble. Getting closer. But before the door opened, there was one final moment of devastating isolation that must be recorded. One final wound that must be witnessed. Because the cruelest cuts always come just before salvation. Graham Phillips approached Harold's table. He stood too close, towering over the blind man, with the casual dominance of someone who had never been powerless a day in his life. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, his voice low enough that the judge could hear, but soft enough to carry the intimacy of a threat. "I want to be respectful of your time and your condition. But I have to ask you plainly for the record, do you have legal representation today?" Harold said nothing. "Do you have any family members here to support your claims?" Silence. "Do you have anyone, Mr. Whitfield? Anyone at all?" The question was designed to break him. And it nearly did. Harold's hand, the hand that had poured foundations for skyscrapers, that had signed contracts worth millions, that had held Eleanor's face on their wedding day, that had cradled each of his 3 children the moment they entered this world, that hand began to shake. A single tear escaped his clouded left eye. It traced a slow, devastating path down the deep lines of his face, navigating the map of his 74 years like a river finding its way to the sea. Victoria saw the tear. She leaned toward Marcus and whispered, "Oh God, here come the waterworks. Can we just get this over with?" Marcus said nothing. But something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been the first crack in 3 years of cowardice. Derek watched his father cry and felt nothing. Or rather, he felt irritation, the same irritation you feel when a transaction takes longer than expected. His father's tears were an inconvenience, a delay, a bit of theater from a man who had already lost. "Your Honor," Graham Phillips said, turning back to the bench with the confident stride of a man delivering the final blow. The respondent clearly has no representation, no evidence, and no support system. "I move for an immediate ruling, Mr. Phillips." Judge Okonkwo's voice was sharp. Surgical, it stopped him mid-sentence like a hand around his throat. "I will decide when motions are appropriate in my courtroom, not you." Felix blinked, adjusted his tie. Retreated, the judge looked at Harold. Her expression had not changed. But if you looked closely, very closely, you could see something in her eyes that was not professional neutrality. It was recognition. The recognition of one person who understands suffering looking at another who has survived it. "Mr. Whitfield Sr.," she said gently, "you said you have evidence to present. Would you like a brief recess to prepare?" Harold shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor, I don't need a recess." He turned his blind eyes toward the courtroom doors. "I just need one more minute." And then the doors opened. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3 swung open with a sound that would echo in the memories of everyone present for the rest of their natural lives. It was not a dramatic crash. It was not a cinematic slam. It was worse. It was slow, deliberate, controlled the way a curtain rises in a theater, unhurried, inevitable, revealing what was always there, hidden just behind the fabric of assumption. Attorney Jonathan Everett Crane stepped into the courtroom, and the temperature of the room changed. He stood 6 feet tall, silver-haired, ramrod straight in his charcoal three-piece suit, a man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as the courthouse itself. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the light. His green eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of a man who had tried cases before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Virginia Supreme Court, and twice the Supreme Court of the United States. Under his left arm, he carried the leather briefcase. Behind him walked a paralegal carrying 2 banker's boxes. Behind the paralegal walked a second attorney, a young woman in a sharp black suit, carrying a laptop and a look of absolute preparedness. Behind her walked a forensic accountant from one of the Big Four firms, carrying a 3rd box of financial records. And behind them all, the last to enter, the one who drew every eye in the room, walked a man in the uniform of a United States Army colonel, carrying a folded American flag in a triangular display case. This was Colonel James Whitfield, Harold's younger brother. 71 years old, still active in a senior advisory capacity at the Pentagon. A man who had commanded battalions, who had earned a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, who had never once asked his older brother for $1 because the Whitfield brothers understood something their next generation did not, that family was not a business transaction. Colonel James Whitfield walked down the center aisle of that courtroom with the measured cadence of a military march. His dress uniform was immaculate, every medal positioned with geometric precision, every crease sharp enough to cut glass, every button reflecting the fluorescent light like small mirrors. The flag he carried was not a prop. It was the flag that had draped Eleanor's casket at her funeral because Eleanor, too, had served. Army nurse. Vietnam era. Something her grandchildren had never bothered to learn. James set the flag gently, reverently on the table beside Harold. Then he placed his hand on his brother's shoulder. Firm, steady, the grip of a man who was saying, without words, "I'm here. I've always been here. And this ends now." Harold reached up and covered his brother's hand with his own. His clouded eyes glistened, but this time the tears were not born of pain. Derek's face underwent a transformation that was almost biological. The color drained from his tanned skin in a slow, visible tide starting at his forehead and cascading down to his jaw, leaving him the color of old newspaper. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. Victoria's hand froze mid-air, her phone halfway to her purse. Her perfectly composed expression cracked like fine porcelain struck by a stone. Her eyes darted from Jonathan Crane to the boxes, to the colonel, to her father, and back again, performing the rapid calculations of a woman who was beginning to understand that the math she had been doing for 3 years was catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Marcus did something none of them expected. He closed his eyes. And he exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for 3 years and had just been given permission to stop. "Your Honor," Jonathan Crane said, approaching the bench with the unhurried confidence of a man who had no need for theatrics, because the truth was theatrical enough. "I am Jonathan Everett Crane, of Crane and Associates, entering an appearance on behalf of Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr., the respondent, and, as I will demonstrate to this court's satisfaction, the victim of systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and the criminal violation of Virginia Code Section 18.2-178.1. Graham Phillips shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. No notice of representation was filed. No discovery was shared. We were told you were told what you wanted to believe." Mr. Phillips Jonathan interrupted calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And what your clients wanted you to believe. I would advise you to sit down. What I am about to present will fundamentally alter the nature of these proceedings. And you will want to be seated when you hear it." Phillips looked at Judge Okonkwo. Her expression offered him nothing. He sat. Jonathan opened the leather briefcase. 41 years of loyalty, 41 years of preparation, 41 years of a promise made to a friend, all of it contained in one old leather case. "Your Honor, I will be entering into evidence the following items. First, a certified forensic audit conducted by Deloitte and Touche, documenting the systematic misappropriation of $14.7 million from Whitfield construction accounts by Derek Whitfield between March 2020 and December 2022. Second, records of fraudulent power of attorney documents, including expert handwriting analysis, confirming that Mr. Whitfield Sr.'s signatures on the conservatorship petitions were forged. Third, recorded telephone conversations obtained legally under Virginia's one-party consent statute, in which Victoria Whitfield Ashford discusses with Derek Whitfield the plan to, and I quote, "get rid of the old man before he figures out what we've taken." Victoria gasped. Actually gasped, the kind of involuntary sound that escapes when the body reacts before the mind can construct a defense. Derek gripped the arms of his chair. His knuckles went white. His jaw muscles flexed so hard that the tendons in his neck stood out like bridge cables. But Jonathan was not finished. Fourth, Your Honor, and this is the matter that will require the court's most careful attention, I am entering into evidence the last will and testament of Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr., executed on September the 3rd, 2020, superseding all prior wills. He withdrew a document, thick, bound, bearing the unmistakable seals of notarization and witness attestation. The will that the petitioners have submitted to this court, the one dated March 14th, 2020, was drafted under duress and, as the forensic audit demonstrates, signed with a forged signature. The real will, this will, was drafted by me, witnessed by 2 retired federal judges, notarized by a commissioned notary of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and filed in a sealed trust with First National Bank of Virginia. Jonathan looked at Derek. For the first time, emotion crossed the old lawyer's face, not anger, not triumph, but something colder, something like the quiet satisfaction of a surgeon who has located the tumor and is about to remove it. Mr. Whitfield Sr. is not a helpless old man, Mr. Phillips. He is the sole trustee of Whitfield Holdings, a real estate investment trust valued at $67 million. Assets your clients never knew about. Assets that were never subject to the conservatorship because they were never disclosed, because they were never required to be disclosed, as they exist in a separate legal entity predating the conservatorship by 42 years. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs, whispers, the court reporter's fingers flew across the stenography machine. The bailiff shifted on his feet. Rosa Melendez, the guardian ad litem, sat perfectly still because she had known. She had been the bridge between Jonathan and the court. She had filed the quiet motions. She had protected the timeline. And now she watched justice unfold with tears she did not wipe away. Colonel James Whitfield stood behind his brother. his hand still on Harold's shoulder, his jaw set, his eyes forward. A soldier's posture, a brother's loyalty. The kind of support that doesn't announce itself, it simply appears when the battle requires it. Harold sat in his chair, blind eyes facing the bench, and for the first time in 3 years, he breathed. Not a shallow survival breath, not the tight, constricted breathing of a man enduring pain. A deep, full, shuddering breath, the breath of a man who had carried an unbearable weight across an impossible distance and had finally been allowed to set it down. Derek turned to Victoria. Victoria turned to Marcus. Marcus wouldn't look at either of them. And Graham Phillips, the $700 an hour attorney who had strutted into this courtroom with the certainty of a guaranteed victory, began quietly gathering his papers. Because he was experienced enough to recognize in this moment that he was not on the wrong side of a legal argument, he was on the wrong side of history. Judge Okonkwo allowed the courtroom to settle. She took her time. She understood that silence, properly administered, was its own form of justice. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every elder abuse case she had ever presided over, every abandoned mother, every exploited grandfather, every vulnerable human being chewed up and discarded by the people who were supposed to love them most. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I have reviewed the sealed filings you submitted through the Guardian ad litem. I have examined the forensic audit. I have listened to the recorded conversations, and I have read the authenticated will. I am prepared to make the following orders." She turned her eyes to Derek, and in that gaze was the full, terrible power of the American judiciary, the power that exists not to serve the wealthy or the connected, but to protect the voiceless from those who would devour them. First, the conservatorship granted to Derek Whitfield over the person and estate of Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr. is hereby revoked, effective immediately. The court finds that said conservatorship was obtained through fraud, forged documents, and material misrepresentation. Derek's attorney began to stand. "Your Honor, sit down, Mr. Phillips. I am not finished." Phillips sat. Second, the property transfer of the Whitfield family residence located at 1422 Maple Ridge Lane, McLean, Virginia, is hereby voided. Title shall be restored to Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr. within 72 hours. Victoria's face collapsed, not slowly. All at once, like a building imploding, every floor of carefully constructed superiority pancaking into rubble. Her hands gripped the bench in front of her. Her mouth formed words that never became sound. Third, this court is referring the matters of forged signatures, fraudulent conservatorship filings, and financial exploitation to the Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney for criminal investigation and potential prosecution under Virginia Code Sections 18.2, 178.1, and 18.2, elder abuse, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Fraud, the word prosecution, moved through the courtroom like a shockwave. Derek's perfectly maintained composure, the composure that had carried him through years of deception, shattered. "This is you can't, Dad." "Dad, listen to me." Harold turned his head toward his son's voice. Slowly, the way a man turns to look at something he has already decided to leave behind. "I'm listening, Derek," Harold said quietly. "I've been listening for 3 years. In the shelter, on the bus bench, in the cold. I listened to everything. You listened to your sister say I should be put in a home so you could sell the house. You listened to your brother agree because he was too afraid to say no. And you stood in my kitchen, the kitchen I built with my own 2 hands, and you told your attorney that I was mentally incompetent. Your father. The man who taught you to read. The man who carried you to the hospital when you broke your arm falling off your bicycle at 6 years old." Harold's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Quiet truth, spoken by a man with nothing left to lose, is the loudest sound in any courtroom. I am blind, Derek, but I am not broken. I was never broken. I was waiting. Derek's face crumpled. The arrogance, the calculation, the predatory confidence, all of it drained away, leaving something raw and ugly beneath. Not remorse. Not yet. Remorse requires a capacity for empathy that Derek had not yet demonstrated. What remained was fear, pure animal fear. The fear of a man who has built his life on a foundation of lies and has just felt the first crack beneath his feet. Marcus stood, his chair scraped against the floor. Everyone turned. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice breaking, I'd like to cooperate. With whatever investigation you're referring, I'll testify. Against my brother. Against my sister. I should have spoken up 3 years ago. I should have opened the door instead of closing the curtain. He looked at Harold. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." Harold's hand reached out into the space between them. Trembling, searching, Marcus crossed the aisle. He took his father's hand. And Harold wept, not in grief. In the terrible, aching, complicated relief of a father who discovers that one of his children, even one, still carries a fragment of humanity. 6 months later, Harold Raymond Whitfield Sr. sat on the porch of 1422 Maple Ridge Lane, McLean, Virginia, his home. The morning sun fell warm across his face, a face that had filled out, that had regained color, that smiled more often now than it had in years. Colonel James Whitfield sat beside him in a rocking chair, sipping coffee from an army mug, reading the morning paper aloud, because that's what brothers do. Inside the house, Rosa Melendez was coordinating with a home care team, not because Harold was helpless, but because he deserved comfort. Real comfort. Earned comfort. The comfort of a man who had survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged not with vengeance, but with justice. Whitfield Holdings continued to thrive. Its $67 million in assets were now managed by a board that included Jonathan Crane, Colonel James, and at Harold's quiet insistence, Marcus. Because Harold believed in redemption. Not cheap redemption. Not easy forgiveness. But the kind of redemption that is earned through action, through accountability, through the daily difficult choice to become better than you were. Derek and Victoria faced criminal charges. Their trial was pending. Their assets were frozen. The Tom Ford suits and Chanel jackets hung in closets they could no longer afford to heat. Jonathan Crane visited every Sunday. He and Harold would sit on this very porch, two old men who had kept a promise for over 4 decades, and they would talk about everything and nothing about Eleanor, about the Army, about the way the world changes, and the way some things never do. "You could have told them, you know," Jonathan said once, "about the Holdings, years ago. Might have prevented all of this." Harold shook his head. "No, Eleanor was right. Money shows people's true faces. I needed to see their faces, Jonathan, even if I had to see them with my ears instead of my eyes." He paused. "And I needed them to see mine." So let me ask you this. Comment number 1. If your own family betrayed you at your weakest moment, would you have the patience Harold showed, or would you have fought back immediately? Comment number 2. Do you believe Marcus deserved a second chance? Was his courtroom confession enough, or does closing that curtain haunt him forever? Comment number 3. What would you have done if you were the neighbor who found Harold on that bus bench at 4 in the morning? If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then subscribe to Karma's Heiress. Hit that notification bell. Because in this channel, the powerless don't stay powerless. The truth doesn't stay hidden. And karma always reads the real will.